Welcome to 1850 Main Street, a place where friends get together and talk about their country and hope for a brighter future. Your hosts have built this spot over the past 40 years, meeting every day with people who are in the headlines and behind the real stories. Today, Rob Walgate and Alan C. Duncan from the Public Square are joined by David Zanotti, the CEO of the American Policy Roundtable.
So what are the odds that we could actually make congressional term limits happen? And how would we do it?
Well, Dave, we received a question via email from a listener. They're asking, from your perspective, is a constitutional amendment likely to enact term limits for members of Congress?
That's a very deep question, because it has lots of different possibilities.
And there's a lot of historical meaning behind that question.
Yeah, there really is. The first question we've got to remember is that we're talking about federal offices, and therefore we would need a federal amendment to the Constitution. And one way that happens is through the House and the Senate passing by supermajorities an amendment out to the people. Simple term limits amendment. So it'd have to be initiated by Congress, passed by Congress in a supermajority, sent to the states, and then ratified. And of course, that brings us to what are the odds that the current incumbent class in the House and the Senate would ever pass a measure that would cause them to ultimately limit their potential to serve in that body. Now, you could do it in such a way that they were grandfathered in. You said like there'd be, say, 4 terms for the House and 2 terms from the Senate, or 6 terms from the House and 2 terms from the Senate. So it was 12 and 12 in both bodies. And
the clock starts new for everybody.
It starts new the day that it's ratified by the states. So they would be basically guaranteeing themselves probably the opportunity for another 12 to 14, maybe as many as 18 years of being able to stick around. Okay, that's one way to do it. But where would the momentum come to get those people, even from a safe harbor, to do this for the good of the country? And the truth of the matter is, there is no such momentum on Capitol Hill, and hasn't been for a long time.
It would almost take a groundswell of people sending representatives there specifically to do this. You'd have to campaign on it. I will vote to do this.
So that's exactly the right reality, Alan. And what happened is back in 1992, when we began working on term limits in the states, which culminated itself by 94. And of course, we started before 92, and people had been at this for a long time. We got involved with a lot of good people around the country and helped in a number of states get term limits measures passed. We even helped construct some of those measures in the states for state constitutional measures that would bring term limits to the states. And in multiple states, that included federal offices. So we tried to move this up through the states. So in a state like Ohio, for example, or a state like Florida, you had a situation where the people said overwhelmingly, we want to limit ourselves, because that's really what term limits is. Term limits is voters saying, I will limit my choices for representation. I will restrict my ability to be represented to the following equation. Now, those restrictions are all there. You can't elect an 18-year-old to the House of Representatives. You can't elect a 20-year-old to the White House. There are things in our Constitution where we specifically say, there are things that you can and can't do. You still have to be born in America to be run for the presidency of the United States. We've chosen to limit ourselves to those choices, and people were choosing to do that in the states. We thought there was a good chance it would pass Supreme Court muster, but it didn't. All the other term limit statutes, what you can do in the House, the Senate, the state level, those were all upheld. But what went down were the federals.
So with the federals going down at the Supreme Court, with them saying that can't come from the people of the state because it's a federal office, right. Obviously, if the people were to do that again, it would be ruled unconstitutional unless it had a large difference or somewhat of a difference for the court to take the case again. Because I'll tell you what, I don't see the court of today writing the same majority opinion that the court in 92 wrote.
No, I think we'd have a chance with this court, but I think you're intimating that it'd have to be very carefully crafted. The language of what was happening at the states would have to be crafted in a way that the court would find it to be different from the other, not just in the time frames of the provisions, but in the context of being able to overcome the argument that federal offices can only be altered by federal resolution. Now, here's where it gets a little difficult. Back in the COVID era, the court chose to look the other way when states changed the rules on federal elections without going through their legislatures. And the Constitution of the United States says there is no way that they can do that electoral changes regarding federal offices can't be dictated by governors or by health departments. They have to be done by the state legislature. And several of the election changes that would happen in regards to federal elections happened without the legislative process involvement. And that should have been enough reason to have struck down those issues. And the court had that presentation, but they ducked. They walked the other way. Now, probably it was because it came too late. It came in essence virtually after the fact instead of being immediate. The first state that changed their federal election rules should have been Ohio. As soon as Mike DeWine changed a primary in the state of Ohio that included federal offices by the dictate of the governor, not by the action of the legislature, an immediate suit should have been filed to the U.S. Supreme Court directly, or at least in federal court with the hope of an immediate expediency to the case.
Yeah, St. Patrick's Day 2020.
Because it was not legal according to the U.S. Constitution. But because people waited to the very end of the process to file, and there should have been multiple cases in multiple states, maybe if it had been done in a timely fashion, the court would have been willing. All right. But now that's an interesting piece in the makeup of what we've been through. That's different from where we were when the Supreme Court decision was made back in 1994.
So, and I'm not looking for specific names, so we're going to talk in generalizations. Have there been folks that have said they believe in term limits, but once they get elected and get to Washington, D.C., then all of a sudden they don't believe in term limits any longer? I know Alan's suggestion that, hey, we send people there with that mantra. Haven't there been plenty of people there that have went with the mantra and the idea of I don't want to serve that long?
This goes back to how might you change the proposal this time? Let's say in state A, we have candidate number one who ran on term limits, campaigned for term limits, petitioned for term limits in his own state, talked about term limits everywhere he went, and then decided to stick around forever.
Why don't we name some names, Rob? I don't, you said we don't want to.
Let's just say that's happened.
No. We did. It's candidate A.
Yeah.
Candidate A. You're being nice.
There are many people who ran for office, supported term limits, and left office.
Yes.
People have left after 2 terms in the Senate. Yes. And remember, they're under no obligation as a federal official. They did it anyways, and to be highly commended. But let's say that we've got one who didn't, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 12 or 20 or 30 or more who have said that they would and then they didn't. What if a state were to come back and say, okay, let's do this. Let's send the Supreme Court this position, which would be that the law would state, passed by the people in the state on their constitution, that basically said, after X number of terms in the United States House, a candidate who is an incumbent, the following language must attend this person's placement on the ballot. And then when you set up a 2-tiered vote, if you've been there past the limits, the first thing you have to say is, this person is here past the term limits that we've passed in the state. And it must be noted that this incumbent is there in spite of what the voters did in such and such a time on term limits. And it must be recognized.
So it'd almost be like a 2-tiered vote. We may not want their opponent, but we don't want them either.
And what if they were there past term limits? So that'd be a double vote. 1, I recognize, I vote that they're past the limit, and B, I vote for them anyhow. In other words, these are just creative ideas, and you could pick holes in any of them. But what if you tried something creatively at the state level that would force them to own the fact that they're past what the people said they wanted them there, and we're going to have to acknowledge that for them to appear on the ballot.
Thanks for stopping by at 1850 Main Street. We're glad you're here. Do you want to learn more about what is really going on behind the scenes in public policy? Tune in to The Public Square on over 200 radio stations coast to coast. Or download the free Public Square mobile app from your app store. Just look for The Lamppost. Find out what America is really talking about at thepublicsquare.com.
That's a cool idea. The other idea I had is less legal, but maybe more
effective.
No, maybe more fun. We could do bumper stickers or T-shirts that say George Washington for term limits. Because how did we get this far away in our country from the precedent set by POTUS number 1?
Right.
As you talk about in your book first, he showed you what it was like to walk away. There's a song in the musical Hamilton that talks about that. Teach him how to say goodbye. We forgot how to say goodbye, and he did that for a reason.
Yes.
Yeah, and that brings me to then what do you say to folks who say, well, if term limits would have been important to the founders, then they would have put it inside the Constitution.
Well, what we'd say is read a book.
Or just look at what they actually did.
Yes. And understand they weren't making money much of the time when they were there. It wasn't a lifestyle.
And if you read a few books about these people and why and what they went through, you would discover that they actually weren't more virtuous than we are necessarily. They thought that we would never become as non-virtuous as we've become.
We're so addicted to that political culture.
They didn't put it in because they didn't believe that anyone would actually ever make a career out of doing this. They thought it would be shameful, and they never thought we would be so stupid as to let them.
Surprise.
It's one of the few things they really missed when it came to human nature.
They did.
All right.
They did.
But because they left the amendment process in,
they gave us a way to fix it.
We can fix it. Now, it's really difficult to fix. A federal amendment to the Constitution is very difficult to do because
it should be, right?
It should.
It should be.
And so people are constantly looking for other methodologies by which to get this done, which brings us to the Article 5 Constitution idea, which is for the states to call for an Article 5 Constitutional Convention, which would, in essence, be proclaimed for the purpose of passing federal term limits. On paper, that sounds great. On paper, I mean, theoretically, it sounds great. I mean, I think and we're almost there. There are a lot of states. Yeah, I question. Tom Hanks in the room.
Rob's literally raising his hand right now.
Yes. Question.
Why do we need a convention to do that? If they could do it, why don't they just do it without the convention?
Well, because this is what would happen is the state convention would be, the states would call for the convention for the purpose of passing term limits, and they would do so. Okay. And that would force an amendment, to go out to the states and in essence leave Congress out of the process. That's how you get around them.
Right. But then we're trusting the same people as part of the establishment to do it. I know we got to trust them at one point or the other anyway.
Well, but the amendment comes back to the states, and then here's the question. The states can prescribe, and the convention can prescribe that this is not something that will be ratified by state legislatures, but it will actually be ratified by a full vote of the people.
Let's do the vote of the people.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is how, and this is why some people are saying an Article 5 convention, and on paper, an Article 5 idea, on paper, it works. There's just one problem. There's absolutely no historical precedent that says that if you choose to vote for a constitutional convention in the states for a limited agenda, that agenda has to be enforced once the constitutional convention begins. They can go anywhere with it.
And that's my point. We have to trust the lawmakers that they're only going to do that one thing. And once the floor is open, what happens? I mean, that sounds like chaos.
Yeah, first off is we don't know who the delegates will be. All right. And so
that's a lot more trust than maybe what we have now.
In other words, there's a lot of moving parts. When you first put it down on paper, it's like, well, of course, let's do it. It was designed for that. But then you look at the nuances. There's always one other piece of the puzzle. People can come back and say, yeah. But it's still got to come back and be ratified from the states. So if they do all that mischief in it, it all blows up, and then they bring it back to the states. We'll vote it all down anyhow. Well, that's true. That's also true. The problem becomes, do you want to go all that way and then have to blow it all up and realize all that we've wasted, all that we've risked, et cetera? Or would it be smarter to do what Alan just recommended, which is, why don't we just keep firing people every time they go past term limits and not vote for them? Just simply walk away, or have the courage to vote for their opponent, even if we're diametrically opposed to their opponent, simply because term limits and the right of truthful representation is the biggest issue. And it's really a priority question. That's the reason we haven't seen it fixed. If people who believe in term limits believed enough that if they were Democrats, they would vote for Republicans, or Republicans, they'd vote for Democrats, or they wouldn't vote at all to make certain that the person that's breaking the rules didn't get back in, they wouldn't vote that race, then you know what would happen? In about 6 years, 3 election cycles, you'd see this situation resolve itself.
And in a sense, it's not voters limiting themselves. It's voters expanding access to other candidates.
We can look at it from either side of the coin. The people still have the power to do it, and the people could have changed it. And this was a debate that happened after the 92 to 94 successes and then the court striking this down. The leadership that was made up in the states, which now has basically mostly disappeared, and it makes sense. I mean, we're talking about 94 till today, had a decision to make. And that decision is, what are we going to do? Are we going to continue to go forward as organizations and aligned coalitions and try to raise lots of money and pick off specific people and go after those people and set such a trend that if you win one this year and two years from now and 6 years from now and eight years from now, where you keep letting people know that if you're going to violate term limits, we're coming after you and you won't be able to. Could you do that the old-fashioned hard work, knuckle, dirt, fingernail type stuff in the rough and tough? And they said, nah, they didn't want to do that. It would take too long. Well, that was 94. Here we are.
I just have a hard time believing that every 2, 4, 6 years that we can't find 535 qualified individuals out of that 330 million to serve the American public, that we think we have to have the same people there for 50 plus years.
Yeah, because this is hard work. Self-government is hard work. And it's easier to just phone it in. And it's easier for both groups to phone it in. And the elected officials and the voters. This really is a very difficult subject because it forces us all to look in the mirror and say, when's the last time I made a significant, sustained sacrifice so that the United States Congress would be more in touch with the people? When's the last time I backed a candidate? I helped someone run for office. I encouraged somebody. I ran for the office myself. When's the last time I took this serious enough to change my life? And I wish that we had enough people. It doesn't take 51%. I just wish we had enough people who cared enough that were willing to do it. And it's with a great amount of shame, with tears, that I have to say we don't. Now, in some places in the country, we do, and they're much better off. But in many places, people, they just phone it in and they move on.
It's all on our shoulders. We have work to do.
The conversations are just getting started. To get connected, check out 1850mainstreet.com. We don't data mine anyone or sell your information. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single conversation. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.